Hi there, and welcome to the SciArt Edit Podcast, where we talk about fascinating ideas and projects from our time that bridge the gap between science and the arts. In this episode, I chat with Heather Ackroyd and Dan Harvey, two internationally acclaimed artists from the UK, renowned for their innovative approach to art, blending nature with sculpture and photography to create thought-provoking works that showcase their passion for ecological health and climate change. I first came across their work in July of last year, when I made a trip down to the Dear Earth exhibition at the South Bank Centre in London. It was here where I came across a series of these giant-sized portraits of environmental activists made entirely from living grass. Yep, you heard right, grass. By harnessing the power of photosynthesis, Heather and Dan created these mesmerizing pieces that literally breathe as you witness them. In addition to looking at the creative process behind these works, I'll be talking to Heather and Dan about their artistic journey and how collaborating with scientists has gone into both shape their artistic practice and provide valuable insight into the field of evolutionary ecology. Now, it's worth mentioning that if you find yourself scrambling to find the art that we'll be referring to in this episode, you can always head over to their website, which I've included in this episode's description below. Without further ado, let's jump right into the conversation. Hi there, welcome Dan and Heather. I was wondering, to kick us off, whether you could briefly introduce yourselves and tell us a bit about what inspired you to pursue art and specifically to explore the natural environment in your work.
So I'm Heather Ackroyd. I'm part of the collaborative practice Ackroyd and Harvey. I would probably go back to my childhood where my grandparents, my grandfather was involved in market gardening, but he was always involved, particularly during the war, with gardening and growing. So I think even though we had small gardens in sort of relatively suburban estates when we were growing up, and my parents were always choosing to live as close. In fact, every home we had we backed onto a copse of trees, and we would always that was always the kind of the space that we would venture into and have adventures in, and sort of make discoveries, play games, climb trees, make swings and all of that. But I think I've always been, my parents were always very keen on nature and birds and walking and wildlife and a lot of stuff, really. So I think all of that really just sort of filtered into me as I was growing up.
And I'm Dan Harvey, and yes, we've been working together for getting on for 33 years now. Yeah, I suppose my parents were both artists, so I was brought up, and I don't think I thought I would become an artist, actually. I wanted to be a vet, but that didn't happen. And both my parents were involved with the travelling communities here in the UK, and I used to spend a lot of time in the woods mainly with my father, I suppose, because he used to go up and film the animals and the deer and things up on a hill near here, Leith Hill. And so from a very early age, I was fascinated by going into the undergrowth and finding bones and skeletons and just sort of being out in the woods. And nature very much just enters into you when you're in those environments.
I can imagine. So why or how did grass enter your practice then? If you've been in touch with, I guess, bones and stones and other such inorganic material in nature, what drew you to grass in particular?
For me, I was using actually a lot of bones and dead things within my sculptural work, and it was to me very much about life. So somehow people look at maybe a shell and see it as a thing of beauty, but that's an external skeleton. When they see a skull, it's immediately maybe slightly more sinister. And so the idea of bringing in a living element, because I was very much wanting to talk about a life force, and grass is probably one of the simplest things.
And at that point in time, were you already exploring the conservation of nature and climate health? Or was it that you were purely experimenting with the material rather than it being connected to a theme or topic as such?
I think going back going back 30 years, climate change was something that we were aware of, but it certainly wasn't at such an intense point that we find ourselves in now, or we found ourselves in. So slowly over the time, working with a certain material and working in a certain way, you start to pick up on things, and you suddenly realize that actually the two things are almost symbiotic. The work that we're doing and the direction we were going in. I don't know, in the end, as an artist, you end up doing work about things that interest you. And our interest in the beginning was living materials and life. And then when you start to realize that the whole of that life as we know it on this planet is under threat, then there's a certain shift that took place slowly over a number of years.
And in that kind of time frame, when you started to engage more with the scientific characteristics of the material, because your art was influenced by it, was that when you came across photosynthesis, or was it something you were aware of when you were young, like in school? And why did you choose to invite this very complicated process of photosynthesis into your work?
It was actually the first time that Heather and I worked together in a village, Busana Vecchia, in the north of Italy. It's an occupied village, but we had use of this space that was a big vaulted ceilinged room, and there was very directional light in the room. We had a very small budget, but we grew the whole interior with grass, and there was a ladder that was leaning against the wall, of handmade curved ladder, but its shadow was imprinting on the wall. Not that we knew it was imprinting until we moved it, but when we moved it, we became aware of this lighter grass below in the form of the ladder, a bit like some of the first photographs of Henry Fox Talbot in England, with a haystack and a ladder. And it started us thinking that possibly there was a way to work with photosynthesis. And I think it was a year later that we actually did some experiments, and it's a process that we've been sort of perfecting over the last 30 years. I think every time we do a piece, we're manipulating and changing the process slightly.
To that piece of work, in terms of, we're learning every time. You can never ever take anything for granted working, in particularly in the way we do, because the material is being forced in some ways. It's not a natural growing position for it, and so we have to be, as Dan was saying, we have to be really, really attentive to the tending. But the photosynthesis work is this. There is something quasi-magical about it, and on a scientific level, they're still trying to understand how that water molecule is split by a photon of light. It's phenomenal. It's billions of years of evolution, and yet it gives us life as we know it, fossil fuels as we wish to burn them. Yeah. And it is a phenomenal. I think chlorophyll is just exquisite. I love it in all of its grace, complexity.
It's one of those things. Without it, as Heather just said, we wouldn't have life on this planet. We wouldn't have the atmosphere. We wouldn't have the food we eat. We wouldn't have the food that the wildlife eat. We wouldn't be here. Things would be very, very different. And what's lovely about chlorophyll is that the actual molecule of chlorophyll is exactly the same as the molecule, or the structure of it is the same as the molecule in our blood, in the heme, except in heme it has iron at the centre. In chlorophyll it has magnesium, but the structure's the same. So it's almost, it's part of nature. I think that's the thing, we are all part of nature, and yet sometimes certain people find themselves or think themselves above it, but we are all connected and all part of something that is universal.
Absolutely. And I think especially with what you say, we are genetically closer to plants than we think we are. I mean, you've actually made me recall this really random fact of how we share about 50% of our genes with bananas, which it feels crazy almost, but just goes to show that nature is essentially not far removed from humankind, and that protecting nature is just as much about protecting our species as well. And I think it's so fascinating the way you connect and provoke this kind of conceptual awareness through your art. I'm really curious about the life cycle of the grass you use to make the portraits. Is it that the grass is alive and grows naturally as part of the piece? Or do you stagnate the growth of the grass? I imagine otherwise it must decay at some point, right?
It's quite strange because actually the image has been registered on grass that is no older than about 13 days. So the seed never goes into a flowering state. So in one sense, what actually happens is at that point where the grass is a certain length and the image is imprinted well, we have to dry the pieces. Mm-hmm. So we are at that point actually killing the grass. And this is what we learned when we worked with our scientists, because if we keep watering the pieces, then we get secondary organisms such as mold building up. And of course, if we show them in a fresh state, and even in low lighting, everything that is bright yellow will just seize any available light and start to produce a chlorophyll. And then, we will lose the image. And of course, we've played with that, and we've actually grown a piece and then put it in light, and we filmed it to see how long it took for everything that was bright yellow to go green. And I think it's about 3 days for that image, for all of that grass starved of light. So on some levels, we are still caught up in this situation where to really stabilize the image, we have to kill the grass. But we are at a point where for those 13 days of nurture, we're on it. We're on it.
So wait, how do you nurture it? What does the nurturing process involve?
Basically, we grow these photographic photosynthesis pieces, but they're grown, we turn the whole gallery space into a dark room, and the canvases are grown with the seed placed on them vertically, and we project a negative image onto them. So the only light they receive when they're growing is from a projected negative. We use very large analog projectors. And where the light falls, it produces the chlorophyll and goes dark green. Where there's slightly less light, goes slightly less green. Where there's no light, it will grow, but it's a vibrant yellow. So you get the equivalent range to a black and white photograph, but in tones of dark green to this vibrant yellow. And so as the pieces are growing, you're nurturing them. The seed is planted very close together. But then to exhibit them, we have to reverse that whole process and dry them. So it's through the drying process that the grass dies, but that allows us to exhibit the pieces. Depending on the lighting levels, they can last for years, but otherwise at the end of the process, they get composted. So they are ephemeral.
It took, so we first made this discovery, as Dan said, 1990. We first did our prototype pieces in 1991. But, as Dan was said, we didn't really understand how we could potentially arrest the image, stabilize the image, or fix it, if we're using photographic terms. And that was directly our collaboration with scientists. And, that was at the Institute of Grassland and Environmental Research. And now it's called IBAR, and it's based at Aberystwyth University now. So, it's a seat of, it's a worldwide global seat of learning about plants, plant behaviors and biology. But the scientists we work with were just extraordinary and very brilliant, and they were equally inspired by what we were doing. And in fact, that completely changed their methodology of understanding how chlorophyll manifests. Well, they understood the pathway of chlorophyll breakdown, but they began to realize they could study the plant material in a very, very different way. So that was an incredibly symbiotic and reciprocal, art science partnership.
It's actually led on to whole centre, the Phenomics Centre in Aberystwyth, and it's influencing so many ways of, without actually having to physically analyse plant material, they realised that through the difference in subtle changes in colour, with using a hyperspectral scanner, they could get certain information from living plant material. And that has developed into a huge scientific research process at the moment. They can scan fields, work out where they need more fertilizer in theory. It's led on to a whole different scientific approach to plant material.
That's incredible how your collaboration prompted an entire body of research in that direction. Were you curious to work with other plant species, or did you restrict yourself to grass?
Well, at the time, the grass that we worked with when we were working with the scientists was, interestingly, they were collecting many different species of grass from the fields in and around. The grass grows very well in Wales because it's a cool, temperate, lots of water. And the story goes that they'd brought in a series of kind of, clumps of grass that they'd put into the greenhouse, in pots, so they could do various studies. And it was a really warm period. Nobody was around to water it. So, when they came back over it was a really hot time. Most of the grasses had gone brown or yellow, which is the plant's response to stress. Will discard the chlorophyll making process because it's energy intensive, and actually it just puts its energy back in the roots. Apart from one grass, which was a fescue, which had come from a neighboring hillside, and they realized that it was an anomaly, this grass, and they thought, why is this grass still green? Why is everything around it dying and drying? Why is this grass, to all intents and purposes, still looking healthy? So actually, I think it was that provoked the scientists, and it was the scientists in Wales working with a science person in Zurich, in Switzerland. They actually worked out the pathway of chlorophyll breakdown, which had never been looked at before. So we ended up working with this particular seed, which at the time was in research, and it was called a stay green grass. And of course, when we were drying it, it didn't go, these blades of grass, the stay green grass, didn't go brown. They kept their green color. And so actually that really worked for us, So then that grass seed became part of a commercial blend of grass that you could, and also it had drought resistant properties. But recently, the grass has thrown off the genetic trait. This is very traditional Mendel-based, crossbreeding. But then at some point a few years ago, the grass just threw it off. It just reverted back to what it was and threw off this introduced trait,
That's remarkable. It just goes to show how complex it must have been for you to keep up with the evolutionary genetics of each of the species you've worked with, to kind of, trial and error what works and why it doesn't work. Just going back to your work again, how do you choose who to depict or create a portrait of? I understand in the Dear Earth exhibition, for example, that you depicted individuals from the Climate Conscious Collective across London.
The portraits that we create are working with what we could call either earth protectors, activists, and I think specifically for the Dear Earth exhibition at the Hayward Gallery, we'd been thinking, why is Britain one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world? Why is that? It's like 16th from the bottom, and yet, there's all of this kind of like, all of this kind of entitled thinking and presentations of this island. And I was thinking, but it doesn't match up. We've got so many species that are at risk of extinction. And actually what it comes down to a number of things, one of which is the intensity of agricultural systems here, uses of massive amounts of fertilizer and nitrates and, insecticides. But also it's around the fact that over the last 3 centuries, so much land has been enclosed. There is a massive amount of land which is in ownership of a tiny percentage of people. So we thought, let's find London collectives. It was very important it was collectives, people working for a collective good. And through that, we found these really wonderful people who said, yes, we will represent, the collective that we work with. And, we have such beautiful friendships now. We all get along so well.
Yeah.
And lots of humor, and we just sort of share lots of, appetite in the sense of still moving forward and, expanding the activism, but using creativity at the absolute core of that, using creativity and culture to win hearts as well as minds,
And do you feel that same level of confidence when you work with scientific collaborators who aren't familiar with, with the art field or how these residencies or collaborations work? Because one of the things I've heard from my friends who are also artists, and kind of the challenges they faced in working with someone from a completely different discipline, is that it's very difficult to kind of bring them down to your kind of the way that you see the world. It's very different from, of course, how scientists see the world, in that it's more evidence driven and, you know, more data driven. And I mean, I'm not saying that all scientists perceive the world not as abstractly as artists, but I mean, I'm sure you can appreciate there is a very different way of perceiving it. And so I just wanted to hear your take on, you know, any difficulties that you may have faced while working with the Institute. What was that process like?
I think, I mean, when we first contacted Eiger in Aberystwyth, we were introduced to one scientist who wasn't so receptive, perhaps, but he passed us on to a colleague of his, Professor Howard Thomas, and he really got where we were coming from, and suddenly everything took off from there with his wife Helen Owen. They were so. I mean, at times it takes a while of shaking things up and finding the right sort of paths and routes to go down. But
I mean, I think, as Dan said, you know, Sid his kind of like, you know, nickname was Sid, and he was in a band called Plankton jazz band. So he was a musician, you know, had a great sense of humor. Helen, you know, his partner was a very accomplished scientist, so they collaborated together. And, you know, they worked across their fields, so they were very, you know, sympathetic to how we work. And it was just, you know, I think we're kind of, we've been very, very fortunate that we've found a fluidity within many of the best, you know, collaborative relationships that we have. I mean, you know, as I was saying, I spent most of my 20s collaborating in some pretty testy and provocative situations in the whole performance theatre circle. And, you know, you actually, I think in a way you find a way of being with people. And I think we just, to some extent, we've just been very fortunate about commissions we've had. And, you know, we managed to kind of like come in pretty quickly and find the people who are very receptive. And, you know, again, it becomes reciprocal. Mm-hmm. And I think that for me is about, you know, collaboration. So, I just think it's something I'm always loved the way other people think. And I love their experience and their expertise, you know. I kind of, a mixture of being in awe and admiration and just curiosity.
Sometimes there's a sort of serendipity that arrives, that you find yourself in a situation and maybe you're not quite with the right people, but through conversation, suddenly an hour later you're introduced to somebody else, and that leads to I'm just thinking about in Sri Lanka with Ranil Senanaika. We arrived there and we weren't sure where we were going, but literally within the sort of first 48 hours of being there, we had met just the right people somehow, and they weren't the people we were meant to be meeting, but it just took off. So it's sort of throwing yourself into something, and then if you're lucky, there's a way that things take off and take you somewhere else, and the work completely shifts and changes. And I think a lot of that is, to me, that is a sort of luck of, I mean, it's obviously us being within a situation, but there's one needs good fortune as well.
As a final top off, just because I've been curious about it, in the growing landscape of technology and this new age of digital art, how do you see the role of climate activism in art evolving? What potential do you see for it in the future? And has, or is it affecting your process, your profession as artists?
I was just interested because we subscribe to New Scientist, and, you know, one of the feeds, I mean, we get the magazine, but one of the images that came in was an extraordinary aerial shot of a lake in Venezuela, where they could actually see where the lake was being really badly polluted as a result of urban development right on the shores of that area of the lake. It's just extraordinary now. You know, these satellites that have you could see such detail that you can see illegal forestry happening in action. So in a way, there can be this other form of surveillance, which is more again about earth protection, you know, that there can be accountability because of this phenomenal detail, and, you know, what can be shared digitally as well, and how you can direct that. So I think it is very, very important. And, as I say, we moved for our photosynthesis work. We couldn't do that without either cameras or a projector. So we use digital, we use analog, and we moving all the way through this stuff.
It is a funny one though, because as far as analog photography and digital photography go, the projections on the grass won't read from a laser projector or a digital projector because it's a different sort of light and frequency. Whereas the grass, if you project from an analog projector, just a negative with a light bulb onto the grass, it prints. If you're using digital projection, it doesn't work. So the digital side of things is useful to create the negatives, but it's not what we use when we project.
But I still, having said that, I just think it's just so important to get out, understand the land around you, the water around you, understand the creatures around you, and
to observe things, really, isn't it? Observing nature, I think, is something that both Heather and I have been doing for many years, and that's where the inspiration comes from. One thing, we've spoken a lot about the photosynthesis works, but there's an awful lot of other work that are part of our practice. We use it in organic growth, crystalline growth, decay, and erosion and things. So the living photographic works are one thing, but there's a whole other body of work that is all related, but very different.
Wow, I really wish we had all day to talk about all these fascinating works that you're mentioning. But what I'll do is I'll pop some links in the description for all our eager listeners out there who would like to know more about your practice. But yeah, thank you so much, Heather and Dan. It was a pleasure to deep dive into your fascinating works of photosynthetic art. Just another example of how art and science can combine in a unique way to inform our perception of the current state of the world we live in. Now, whilst the Dear Earth exhibition is sadly over, you can follow Dan and Heather on Facebook at Ackroyd and Harvey, or their website, ackroydandharvey.com, to stay updated on upcoming installations of their work. And if you like this episode, I really would love it if you'd share it. You can also find and subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or on your favorite listening app. I'm the producer and your host, Koyal. Thank you so much for listening, guys, and stay tuned for the next episode. Bye-bye.